A red stain spreads across the Louisiana sky, making it look like a feverish sunset that isn't a sunset at all. The Belle Reve Plantation is dying on the night of November 4th, 1858. The wild, orange flames eat away at the cypress wood siding of the grand house, taking with them 17 years of secrets in a loud, crackling roar. On the well-kept lawns below, volunteer firefighters and neighbors from as far away as St. Francisville shout uselessly against the fire, their faces lit up in horror. They think they are here to save the life of the reclusive widow Blackwood. Sadly, they are wrong. Long ago, in a place no one knew existed, they lost the life they should have been saving. A young field worker, out of breath and covered in soot, is the first to point to the back of the house where the cellar doors are. Heavy oak, held together by iron straps, leaned against the foundation at an angle and was almost hidden by jasmine vines that had grown too big. "Down there," he yells over the noise. "There's something down there. I hear singing sometimes late at night." The men stop looking at the main house, which is falling apart because they are so desperate to find survivors. They need 4 people with axes and a crowbar to break down the door. The lock is rusted shut because of time and moisture. The wood creaks, then breaks, then shatters, revealing a set of steep stone steps that lead down into complete darkness. A wave of cool, stale air rolls out, bringing with it a smell that is so strange and out of place that it makes the men stop talking right away. It smells like dried flowers, old paper, dust, and something else, something that smells sweet and chemical, like a long-lost pharmacy. A lantern is dropped into the void. Its light hits stone walls that are wet and slick. It lights up a single huge room that is bigger than any of them thought a cellar would be. And then the light finds them. There were 7 high-backed mahogany chairs arranged in a perfect crescent, with a figure in each chair. They used to be girls. They wore the same hand-sewn white linen dresses and had their small hands neatly folded in their laps. Their skin is the color of old parchment and is stretched tight over their fragile bones. Their hair is braided with dried ribbons, and their faces have closed eyes and lips that curve into calm, peaceful smiles. They are not bones. They haven't broken down. They are kept safe, like a bunch of life-sized porcelain dolls left to gather dust in a madman's attic. Perfectly preserved, but horrifyingly so. There are 7 small, unopened music boxes on the floor in front of them. The tarnished silver shines in the light of the lantern. The hardened men who broke down the door, who were used to the violence of plantation life, all gasp in horror. One of them throws up in the jasmine vines. This was not a safe place from the fire. This was a tomb, a shrine, and a place where the dead could have tea parties for all time. A week later, the official parish record would be a short, clinical exercise. It says that the fire at Belle Reve started for no known reason. It says that the bodies of 7 unidentified slave girls were found in a locked cellar, and their deaths were thought to be caused by something other than poisoning. It comes to the conclusion that Mrs. Blackwood, the plantation's owner, was thought to have died in the fire. Her body burned beyond recognition. The case was over, the land was sold, and Belle Reve slowly disappeared from maps. Its story was only told in quiet, scared whispers in the bayou. But the official record is a lie, a comfortable story made up to hide a terrible truth. The story of Ara Blackwood and her 7 eternal children, and what really happened in that cellar, was never meant to be found. It was locked away not only behind an iron door, but also in the coded pages of a journal that wasn't found for another 100 years. The journal was hidden away in the archives of an Augusta Historical Society. Thomas Blackwood, Ara's nephew, wrote in his journal about his trip to Belle Reve in 1857, a year before the fire. He was the last person to learn the truth from the only other person who knew it. There is no fire in this story. It is the story of an obsession that turned into a strange and planned kind of madness. It tells the story of a woman who, because she was rich and powerful, tried to conquer time itself. In doing so, she built a monument to her own evilness that was hidden under the floorboards of a Louisiana dream house. I need to know something before we go down those stone steps back to 1841, the moment the lock clicked shut. Are you listening to this in a place that has its own forgotten stories? A town with a house that everyone talks about but no one goes to. Please tell me where you're from in the comments. We are going to shine a light on the dark parts of history that are closer than we think. Now, let's go back to when Belle Reve wasn't a ruin, but a paradise. A carefully crafted illusion of beauty and order ruled by a woman whose love for perfection was a disease, a creeping sickness that would require the most terrible of sacrifices. Not an act of violence, but a philosophy is what really starts our story. Ara Beaumont came from a rich family in Charleston and was born in 1815. She was a quiet, very observant child who was interested in things that most kids don't care about, like the browning edge of a magnolia petal, the slow fading of a watercolor painting left in the sun, and the first fine lines that appeared on her mother's face. Ara thought the world was a beautiful work of art that was always falling apart. Clara, her younger sister, was a lively, happy child who died of yellow fever when she was 6. Ara, who was 9 at the time, couldn't be comforted by the loss or the quick, brutal change of her beautiful sister into something still and cold. In her teenage diary, she would later write, "Clara was a perfect song, and the world let the notes fade away. What a careless, horrible design to make such beauty only to let it be eaten by time." This irrational fear of change guided her life. She surrounded herself with things that wouldn't break down, like marble statues, oil paintings sealed with varnish, and pressed flowers under glass. She learned how to stuff animals by practicing on birds and small animals. Her delicate fingers were as precise as a surgeon's. She told her shocked governess that she was preserving them to keep their beauty from rotting. At the age of 19, she married Julian Blackwood, a man 15 years older than her. He had just inherited a huge sugarcane plantation in Louisiana. The marriage was planned to bring together Charleston's old money with the raw, valuable land in the West. Julian was a kind and practical man who didn't care about philosophy. He thought his wife's strange obsessions were just the quirks of a cultured, artistic woman. He built her Belle Reve, the beautiful dream, on a quiet bend of the Mississippi River, surrounded by 1,000 acres of sugarcane and a cypress swamp that was almost impossible to get through. It was a neoclassical wonder with white columns, wide verandas, and gardens that were planned with perfect geometry. Ara didn't see Belle Reve as a home. She saw it as a canvas where she could completely control her surroundings and make a world that reflected her ideas of perfect, unchanging beauty. The house was spotless, and the gardens were trimmed to the last millimeter. Inside, 43 enslaved people moved around quietly and in a planned way, each trained to do their job without leaving any signs of their presence. Julian, who didn't have many needs, found the atmosphere of his own home to be stifling, even sterile. "It is a museum, not a home, Ara," he would say softly. "It is a beautiful, cold museum where you are afraid to breathe too loudly." But what really bothered him was Ara's relationship with the children who were slaves on the property. Most plantation mistresses were interested in the children as future assets in a practical, often brutal way. But Ara's interest was different. It was aesthetic. She would watch them for hours as they played near the quarters, her gaze analytical, like a collector looking at things they might want to buy. She was looking for a certain kind of beauty, a fleeting, pure innocence that she thought was the most beautiful thing on earth. She had found them by 1840. There were 7 of them. They were girls between the ages of 5 and 9. They weren't chosen because they were strong or good at work. They were chosen because of their short-lived qualities. Lena's laugh sounded like wind chimes. Celeste's eyes were the color of a twilight sky, and Amara moved with the grace of a young deer without thinking. Ara started to set them apart from the others. She had them brought to the main house, where they were bathed, dressed in fine linen, and given dolls from France. She told them they couldn't work in the fields or the kitchens, because the sun would darken their skin, and the work would hurt their delicate hands. She named them her septituals, which means 7 stars, after the Pleiades constellation. People who were also enslaved called them Mistress's pretty birds, and kept them in a cage made of gold. Their mothers could only see them once a week, and that was a supervised, heartbreaking visit on the porch. The girls seemed to be getting more and more distant, as if they were already forgetting the world of the quarters. Julian said, "This isn't right, Ara. You're treating them like pets or dolls. They're kids. You're going to break their spirits and their mothers' hearts." Ara's answer was cold, and she was sure of her logic. "I am saving them, Julian. In the quarters, they would have to work hard, suffer, and eventually die. They would get old and tired, their beauty would fade, and their innocence would be broken. With me, they are safe. I am giving them a childhood that never has to end." The stress in the house became so strong that it was hard to breathe. The 7 girls were in a strange limbo. They weren't part of the slave community anymore, but they weren't really part of the family either. They were like living works of art, decorations in Ara's perfect world. They had private tutors, but were taught only recitation, song, and posture. They were given special meals on porcelain plates, but they ate in silence while someone watched them closely. Everything changed in the summer of 1841, when it was hot and humid and people were sick. After a week of violent chills and delirium, Julian Blackwood died of malaria. He was 41 years old. His death removed the last weak barrier between Ara's obsession and its full expression. She was now the only owner of Belle Reve. She had full legal control over everyone who lived on its 1,000 acres. There was no one left to ask her questions or stop her. Ara Blackwood did not cry as the estate began its official period of mourning, and black crepe was hung over the mirrors and doorways. Instead, she locked herself in her late husband's study and, with a hand that was terrifyingly steady, she began to make plans for a sanctuary, a permanent home for her 7 stars. A place where their laughter would never stop, their skin would never wrinkle, and their innocence would be safe from the corrupting touch of time forever. A place they would never, ever leave. Ara Blackwood's plan needed more than just willpower. It needed a special kind of knowledge that she didn't have, even though she had studied a lot. Charleston's medical textbooks didn't have any information on how to preserve flesh from the inside out or calm the heart without letting the vessel rot. It was something older and darker, an art that came from the ground in Louisiana. She needed Madame Delphine for that. Delphine was the unofficial leader of Belle Reve's enslaved community. She was a Creole woman in her late 60s with skin that looked like wrinkled leather and eyes that held the wisdom of many generations. She was the plantation's midwife, healer, and secret keeper. Her knowledge came from a mix of Catholic rituals, Choctaw herbalism, and the broken voodoo traditions that came from Saint-Domingue. She knew where the medicines grew in the swamp and where the poisons were hiding in plain sight. She knew how life and death worked together. Ara called Delphine to the plantation infirmary, not to the parlor, after her husband's funeral. Ara had put one of her taxidermy birds on a steel table. It was a perfect blue jay, with its wings outstretched, as if it were flying. "This is how I do it," Ara said, her voice flat. "Arsenic and formaldehyde. It keeps the vessel safe, but it takes away the life and warmth. The result is a brittle shell. I need something better, something gentler." Delphine looked from the dead bird to the mistress, her face blank. She knew that Ara was obsessed with the 7 girls. She had been getting more and more scared as they were taken away from their mothers and turned into silent decorations. Delphine asked in a low voice, "You want to save lives?" "I want to keep a moment of perfection," Ara said. "To seal it like a flower in glass. I've read about old practices and substances that slow the body down and put you to sleep without waking up. But your people know about things like that, don't they?" The room got colder. At that point, Delphine got it. This wasn't a question about theory. It was a request for a way to do something. At first, the old woman wanted to say no and act like she didn't know, but she was familiar with Era. She knew that the mistress's calm demeanor hid a will of steel. The plan would go on even if you said no. It would only get Delphine in trouble, or worse, send her to a much harsher plantation far away from the community that needed her. And Ara might use harsher methods that would make the children very unhappy if she didn't have someone to show her how. Delphine made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life because she was stuck in an impossible moral dilemma. She would work with them, but only on her own terms. Maybe she thought this would lessen the horror or give her a way to avoid it. It was a stupid hope. She told me about a rare, ghostly white orchid that only grew in the deepest parts of the cypress swamp. The Choctaw called it the spirit bloom. When the roots were dried, ground up, and mixed with some mineral salts found in the clay on the riverbed, they made a substance that didn't kill in the usual way. It was a very strong sleeping pill that worked for weeks and months. Given in small, steady doses, it would slowly calm the body's humors, lower the pulse to a faint flutter, and cool the blood. At the same time, its unique alkaloids would stop bacteria from growing and decay from starting. The last, bigger dose would put the body in a state of suspended animation, making it pliable and peaceful. Ara had been looking for a miracle, and this was it, the perfect, gentle way to get to her perfect, eternal moment. The plans started right away, and no one knew about them. Ara sent 2 trusted male slaves into the swamp to gather the spirit bloom. This was a dangerous job that took them waist-deep into water full of cottonmouths and alligators. They were told that if they told anyone about their job, they would be sold downriver, which was worse than death. Delphine started the slow, ritualistic process of getting the compound ready in the main house. She ground the roots in a stone mortar, her hands moving with a heavy, unwilling grace. Ara watched every step with complete focus, and her face was lit up with a terrifying thirst for knowledge. At the same time, Ayara started to change the cellar. She picked it because it was quiet, had a cool, steady temperature, and stone walls that would block out any noise. Enslaved people had to dig out the earth floor, which made the chamber several feet deeper, and then lay a smooth flagstone floor. They painted the walls white and put in a ventilation shaft that was cleverly hidden behind a loose brick in the main chimney to keep moisture from building up. The men who did the work were kept apart from the other workers. They sold the cellar to a trader from New Orleans the week it was finished. They bought their silence and sealed their fates. Ara herself decorated the room. She ordered the 7 mahogany chairs from a cabinet maker in Baton Rouge, telling them to have high backs and a beautiful design. She bought the 7 silver music boxes, each one playing a different lullaby. She put a nice Persian rug on the floor made of stone. She didn't think she was building a tomb. She thought she was decorating a nursery for a long, peaceful sleep. During the late summer and early fall of 1841, the 7 girls were slowly and secretly poisoned. They mixed the tasteless and odorless powdered orchid root into their morning milk, afternoon tea, and sweet jellies they ate for dessert. At first, the changes were small. The girls seemed calmer, and they didn't laugh as much. Their loud games in the yard turned into long, quiet hours spent sitting on the porch with their dolls. They were often sleepy, and their movements became slow and graceful, like they were swimming through water. Their mothers, who could only visit them once a week, and only from the edge of the manicured lawn, were in a state of grief they couldn't name. They could see their daughters drifting away from them. "She is sick, Mistress." Sarah, Lena's mother, begged Ara, pointing to her daughter's pale skin and lifeless eyes. "She needs a doctor. She needs me." Ara's smile was calm, which made me even more angry. "Sarah, she is not sick. She is calm. I am keeping her safe from the worries of the world. She is at peace. You should be thankful." Ara started to systematically break the ties between the girls and their families to make sure she had complete control. The weekly visits were cut short, and then stopped completely. Ara locked Sarah in the plantation's hot box for 2 days as an example to the others when she was caught trying to sneak into the house at night to see Lena. The message was very clear. The kids were no longer theirs. She owned them, body and soul. They were her property, and she could do whatever she wanted with them. The other enslaved people watched this slow-motion tragedy unfold with a mix of fear and rage. They saw the weird orchids being taken out of the swamp. At night, they could smell the strange, sweet smell of Delphine's preparations coming from the infirmary. They could hear the faint sounds of building work going on under the house. They knew that something terrible was going to happen, something worse than the everyday cruelty they faced. People at Belle Reve were afraid, but didn't say anything. The lovely dream was turning into a waking nightmare. The preparations were done by the end of October. The cellar was ready, and Ara's journal now only called it the Chambre des Étoiles, or Room of Stars. The compound was ready. The girls were always sleepy and dreamy. They were beautiful, calm, and mostly cut off from the world around them. In Ara's eyes, they were perfect. She brought the 7 girls into the main parlor on All Hallows' Eve, a night chosen for its symbolic weight and when the veil between worlds was thin. She had sewn them the beautiful white linen dresses they were wearing. They had their hair in braids and ribbons. They looked like little brides or offerings. Ara knelt down in front of them, and the candlelight made her face shine. In a soft, hypnotic voice, she talked to them. "My darlings, my little stars," she said, her voice full of real, if twisted, love. "Tonight, we are going on a wonderful journey. We are going to a special room, a secret garden just for you. There you will drink a sweet tea, and you will fall asleep. You will have the most beautiful dreams, dreams that will last forever. You will never be sad or afraid or lonely ever again. You will be safe with me for all of time." Madame Delphine watched from the hallway, where she was hidden in the shadows and didn't want to be seen. She held a small leather-bound Bible in her hand, and her knuckles were white. The last dose was ready, a sweet, purple liquid in a crystal decanter. It was the tea that would put the girls to sleep forever. 7 mothers stood outside, huddled together in the dark, looking at the lighted windows of the big house and humming a low, sad spiritual. They didn't know what kind of horror was coming, but they knew for sure that this was the night their children would be taken from them forever. Ara led them down the newly cut stone steps, one by one, in a small, sleepy procession into the earth. The girls didn't say anything as they moved, their little hands holding hers with a trusting, heartbreaking innocence. The poison was working slowly on their minds. The cellar had cool air and smelled like wet earth, lime-washed stone, and the faint, sweet smell of the flowers Ara had put in a vase on a small table. The girls probably thought it was a secret cave, a magical place that no one else could see. The 7 mahogany chairs sat quietly in a crescent shape, their polished wood shining like dark water in the light of the lamp. Ara put each girl in her own chair. Celeste, whose eyes were already half closed. Amara, who swayed slightly and smiled faintly. And Lena, who was 9 years old and the oldest. She looked around the room with a flicker of dim confusion, the last bits of her awareness fighting against the chemical fog that was closing in on her. Ara walked between them with the calm focus of a priestess performing a holy ceremony. She smoothed their dresses, fixed a ribbon that was out of place in their hair, and put an unopened music box on the floor at each of their feet. Madame Delphine watched from the shadows at the top of the stairs, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She had brought the last cup of violet tea and was shaking as she handed the crystal decanter to the mistress. She was now told to stand witness, which was the last cruel act of complicity that was forced on her. She was the only other person who knew the truth, and that knowledge would keep her tied to Ara forever. Ara filled 7 small porcelain teacups with the liquid. The sweet, flowery smell of the mixture filled the small room, like a perfume of forgetfulness. She put the first cup to Lena's lips. "Drink, my star," she said softly. "Drink and dream." Lena, who was used to following orders, drank. The liquid was sweet and sticky. She coughed once, and the sound was so small and delicate that it echoed horribly in the stone room. Ara went to the next girl and then the next, giving them her sacrament of eternal childhood. When the last girl, little Zora, who was 5 years old, finished her cup, the room got very quiet. It was the calm before the storm, the calm before the last step. Nothing happened for a few minutes. The girls just sat there, breathing slowly, and their eyes glazed over. Then, one by one, they fell back into their chairs, like candles being put out. Their heads drooped to the side, and their hands fell limp in their laps. The slow rise and fall of their chests became almost unnoticeable. The sleep had begun. Ara walked among them now, like a scientist watching her experiment. She felt their pulses, which were weak and thready under the skin. She put a silver mirror under their noses and waited for the tiniest cloud of condensation to appear. She didn't seem horrified, but rather interested and happy. She had done it. She had stopped time. She had captured their beauty at its best and locked it away from the world. Next, she started the second part of the ritual. She took some tools out of a wooden chest in the corner that shouldn't have been in a child's playroom. They were syringes with fine steel needles, glass vials filled with a clear, thick fluid, and rolls of cotton gauze. Delphine didn't fully understand this part of the process. Ara said, in a voice that sounded like she was interested in the subject, but not too much, that the spirit bloom tea was just the beginning. The blood itself had to be replaced to make sure it would last forever. She had been practicing her own rough way of embalming arteries on deer and other animals for months. Delphine couldn't watch any longer. She let out a strangled sob. "This is not preservation, mistress," she said, her voice thick with fear. "This is desecration. This is an offense against God and nature." Ara turned, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. "God is a careless artist who lets his works die. Nature is a brute that eats beauty. I am better than them. I am a true artist. I am a savior. Now hold the lamp steady, or you will fall asleep in a much less peaceful way." Blackwood worked in her underground lab for the rest of the night while the plantation slept above. What Delphine saw in that basement would haunt her for the rest of her life. How Ara treated the girls' bodies with cold, clinical precision, not as dead children, but as fragile artifacts to be displayed. The slow, careful process that went on until the first light of dawn. Ara stepped back when it was over, her face red from hard work and a terrifying sense of maternal pride. The girls looked just like they did before, but now they were completely still. They were her perfect, eternal children, her 7 stars, fixed forever in the sky of her own private universe. She looked one last time, and then went up the stairs. Delphine followed, her legs shaky, and her soul feeling as empty as the bodies below. Ara shut the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs. She put a huge iron bolt in place, and then she took a heavy, fancy lock off of a chain around her neck. She clicked it shut. The noise was final and complete, like a period at the end of a long sentence. The secret was kept. The story of Belle Reve is about to get even darker, as we enter the mind of a woman who thought she had beaten death and the slow creeping madness that followed. If this story is already making you think about the easy stories we've been told about history, and if it's making you want to know more, then click the subscribe button right now. This is what we do at the Sealed Room. We don't only tell stories. We dig up the bodies, unlock the doors, and read the journals that are off limits. There are a lot more disturbing stories in the archives that you can read. After the cellar was sealed, things seemed to be calm and orderly at Belle Reve for a number of years. To the outside world, Ara Blackwood was just a grieving widow who had become a recluse to take care of her late husband's estate. She never had guests over, and she rarely left the property. She did all of her business through lawyers and overseers. But there was a strange and obsessive secret life going on under this calm surface. A cruel, simple lie explained why the 7 girls went missing. Ara told the overseer that she had sold them to a Creole man in New Orleans who wanted to start a private choir. In a world where people were property that could be bought and sold at any time, it was a believable story. The same story was told to the girls' mothers. Their sadness was huge, but they couldn't say anything. To protest was to risk being whipped or sold. They secretly grieved for their daughters, and their sadness was like poison that spread through the plantation community. Madame Delphine was the only one who knew the truth, and that knowledge was like a prison. Ara kept the old woman close by, always there for her and trusting her. There was no trust between them. They were both using each other. Delphine was the only person who saw Ara commit the crime, and Ara had Delphine's life and the lives of her family in her hands. The fear that lay beneath the house brought them together. Ara's days became very structured and ritualistic. Every morning, she would manage the plantation's accounts with her usual skill, but every afternoon, without fail, she would go down to the cellar. She called it visiting the nursery. She would sit for hours in a rocking chair that was in the middle of the room, in the cool, quiet dark. She would talk to the girls in a soft, friendly voice. She would tell them about the weather, how much sugar cost, and the new dress she had ordered from Paris. She would read them poems, and her voice would echo a little in the stone room. And once a week she would do her maintenance with Delphine's help, even though Delphine didn't want to. She would dust the girls' preserved bodies, comb their hair, and put a thin layer of a waxy, floral-scented balm on their skin to keep it soft. She would turn their music boxes, but she never opened them. She thought that the silence was part of their perfect peace. Ara thought they were still alive. They were just sleeping and waiting. She had convinced herself that what she had done was an act of the highest love and protection. She started writing in her journal not long after sealing the cellar. Her entries show that she has completely lost touch with normal morality. She wrote, "The mothers cry, but they don't get it. They cry for what they lost, but I celebrate what I saved. They would have watched their children get sick, grow old, and die. I have given my little stars immortality. Their beauty will never fade. Their innocence is complete. Isn't my act a greater love than theirs? But a secret of this size has its own pull. It bends everything else around it. The main house of Belle Reve, which used to be a beautiful but sterile place, started to feel like a tomb. The enslaved workers moved through the halls like ghosts, and their whispers stopped when the mistress came into a room. They knew something was very wrong, but couldn't prove it. They knew that the 7 girls had not been sold. No trader had come, and no papers had been signed. They had just gone into the house, and the house had eaten them up. The cellar door, which was now completely hidden by a thicket of jasmine that Ara had purposely let grow wild, became a place of fear for the plantation. As time went on, Ara's grip on reality began to slip. She spent more and more time in the cellar. She would sometimes eat dinner down there with her eternal children who were always quiet. She started having conversations where she spoke for the girls, making up conversations and changing the pitch of her voice to sound like a child's. Delphine, stuck in this shared insanity, watched Ara's mind slowly fall apart and was afraid for her own life. What would happen if the mistress's last link to the outside world broke? Delphine saw a chance for a message to get out in 1857, 16 years after the cellar was sealed. Thomas Blackwood, Ara's estranged nephew and a young writer from Augusta, wrote to say that he was going to visit for the first time to see his uncle's estate. Ara agreed, which was unusual for her because she usually didn't want to show off how well her plantation was doing. Delphine knew this might be her only chance to let go of her problems and tell the truth. She started to make plans, knowing that if Ara found out about her betrayal, she would die quickly, and for sure. Thomas Blackwood's arrival would be the spark that set off the chain of events that would lead to the night of the fire, the breaking of the lock, and the horrible truth that had been waiting in the dark for 17 long years. In May 1857, Thomas Blackwood came to Belle Reve like a lamb walking into a spider's web. He was 24 years old and a smart, literary young man who always had a leather-bound journal with him. He had come to Louisiana looking for ideas for a Gothic novel about the romantic and mysterious South. He had no idea he was about to enter a story that was much more horrible than anything he could have imagined. Thomas felt very uneasy as soon as he stepped onto the porch. There was no denying that Belle Reve was beautiful, but it was the cold, perfect beauty of a corpse in a casket. Not only did the jasmine and magnolia smell fill the air, but there was also a heavy, oppressive silence. The slaves moved in a sneaky, haunted way, and their eyes were always darting toward the lady of the house. And then there was his aunt. Ara was kind and polite, but her presence made me uneasy. When she talked about how perfect and orderly her estate was, there was a glassy, brittle quality to her composure and a fanatic's gleam in her eyes. She looked less like a person and more like a beautifully made robot going through the motions of life without any real warmth underneath. Thomas wrote in his journal that first night, "My aunt doesn't run this house like a home. She runs it like a temple to some unspoken, rigid creed. The air seems to hold its breath when she's around. One feels that knocking over a vase would not be a simple accident, but a terrible act of blasphemy." He tried to talk to her about his dead uncle, her life, and the kids he had heard lived on the estate. Her answers were short and vague. Ara's face turned into a mask of ice when he talked about the 7 slave girls his father had written about in a letter. "They were sold," she said, and her tone made it clear that there was no need for more questions. "It's a business decision. There's no point in talking about it." But Thomas noticed that the older servants flinched when the girls were brought up. He saw the quick, scared look that passed between a housemaid and the old woman who seemed to be his aunt's constant companion, Madame Delphine. Thomas became interested in Delphine. He could see the deep, settled sadness in the old woman's eyes and how her hands shook when she was near his aunt. He thought she was a secret keeper and a prisoner in this beautiful, suffocating house. He started looking for her, and he found her in the herb garden, or the quiet, steamy laundry house, where Ara couldn't bother her. At first, Delphine didn't say anything. Her fear was like a wall around her. She would mumble vague answers while staring at the ground. But Thomas kept trying, and more importantly, he was nice. He didn't talk to her like a slave. He talked to her like a person. He asked her about her family and what her life was like before Belle Revere. The wall started to come down slowly and carefully. She saw in his kind, honest eyes a place to put a truth she could no longer bear to carry alone. It was a week into his visit that things got bad. Thomas saw the overgrown jasmine bush against the foundation while he was walking near the back of the house. He pushed the vines aside out of curiosity and saw the heavy, iron-bound cellar door. The lock was rusted and looked like it hadn't been opened in a generation. He asked one of the stable hands what was in the cellar later that day. The man's face turned white. "Nothing, sir," he said, stammering and not looking Thomas in the eye. "That door, Mistress says it shouldn't be touched, ever." A storm came in from the Gulf that night, keeping everyone inside the house. The loud wind and rain broke the heavy silence. Delphine found Thomas in the library during the storm's chaos while Ara was alone in her study. Her face was a mask of grim determination. "You ask about the pretty birds," she said in a voice that was hard to hear over the storm. "You want to know what's behind that door. You think you want to know, but once you know, you can't put it down." Thomas turned around, his heart racing in his chest. "Please tell me, Delphine." And so the story came out in a flood of quiet, scared words. Delphine told the story of what happened in 1841. She talked about the spirit bloom, the slow poisoning, and the night of All Hallows' Eve. She talked about the cellar, the 7 chairs, and the little girls' bodies, which were still as porcelain. She told him about Ara's weekly rituals, her craziness, and the shrine to eternal childhood that was only a few feet below them. At first, Thomas didn't believe what he heard, but then he felt sick and horrified. The world seemed to be off balance. The house was sterile and creepy, and his aunt was acting strange. The servants were scared. All of this came together to form a picture of such horrible evil that his mind had a hard time accepting it. This wasn't a Gothic book. This was real. "You have to go to the sheriff," Thomas said, his voice half shaking. "You have to tell them what she's done." Delphine laughed bitterly and without sound. "I'm a slave. My word means nothing next to hers. They would call me a crazy, lying old woman. She would have me whipped to death for such a story. No, the law won't touch her, but you are her blood. You are a white man from a good family. Maybe they will listen to you." With this terrible knowledge, Thomas knew he couldn't just run away. He couldn't let that evil grow in the soil of Louisiana. He had to confront her. He had to see it with his own eyes. He waited until the next afternoon, when Delphine said Ara came to see her every day. He saw his aunt in the main hall, a key on a chain in her hand. She was about to go to the back of the house. "Ara," he said, his voice tight and strained, "I want to see the cellar." Ara stopped moving and put her hand on the doorknob. She turned slowly, and her calm mask fell off, showing the cold, hard rage underneath. "There is nothing to see. It is used for storage. It is damp and not good for visitors." "The old woman told me everything," Thomas said, his voice getting stronger. "She told me about the girls and what you've done. I want to see them." For a second, it looked like Ara was going to hit him. Her whole body became stiff, and her eyes became slits. A terrifying silence stretched between them. Then, something strange and scary changed. The fury in her eyes was replaced by a look of serene, pitying condescension. She had a faint, horrible smile on her lips. "You can't possibly understand," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You see the world as a world of decay and ugliness. I have made something holy here, a sanctuary. You think I am a monster? I am a savior. Very well, you want to see? Come. I will show you my work. I will show you what true love looks like." She took him out to the back door and through the jasmine vines that had grown too big. She took the key out of her pocket and put it in the rusty lock with a steady hand. She had to use all of her strength to turn it, and the metal groaned in protest. After being quiet for 17 years, the bolt slid back with a loud bang. Together, they heaved the heavy door open, revealing the stone steps and the familiar cloying scent of dust and chemicals. Ara picked up a lantern, lit it, and went down. She moved in a calm and confident way. Thomas's body shook and his mind yelled at him to run, but he made himself follow her into the dark. The light from the lantern flickered, making shadows dance on the walls. And then it lit up the scene. It was just like Delphine said it would be, but 1,000 times worse in real life. The chairs in a crescent shape, the small, still figures, the pale, perfect faces, and the hands folded in eternal rest. It was a work of art of madness, a tableau of life that had stopped. The room was completely silent, and the silence felt heavy and textured. Thomas gagged and fell back against the stone wall, putting his hand to his mouth. They are dead," he said through tears. "They are at peace," Ara said softly as she moved to one of the chairs and gently stroked the girl's hair. "Look at her. Isn't she beautiful? No illness can touch her, and no sadness can show on her face. She will always be a child. I gave them all that gift, a gift no other mother could give." Thomas Blackwood knew that his aunt was not just evil, she was completely and irretrievably insane as he stood in that cold, quiet tomb. There was no way to reason with her or appeal to a sense of right and wrong that she no longer had. He looked from the preserved bodies of the kids to the happy, proud look on his aunt's face and knew he had to leave. He needed help. "You are a monster," he whispered, his voice breaking. He turned and ran up the stairs, gasping for air as he stepped out into the hot afternoon air. The image of the 7 quiet girls stayed with him forever. He took off running. He didn't stop to get ready. He ran past the main house and through the gardens to the stables, yelling for a horse. But Ara was right behind him, and her calmness was gone. Her face was now a mask of screaming, desperate rage. He had turned down the sacred place she had shown him. He had told her she was a monster. He was dangerous. He knew that he couldn't be let go. "He is crazy," she yelled to the overseer, who came running when he heard the noise. "The heat has gotten to him. He is a danger to himself. Lock him in his room until the doctor can be called." The overseer and 2 other men, who were used to following the mistress's orders without question, stopped Thomas before he could get to the stables. He fought, but there were 3 of them against him. They pulled him back to the house, ignoring his cries of murderer and devil as the ramblings of a crazy person, and locked him in his guest room on the 2nd floor. He was in jail. As night fell over Belle Reve, Thomas Blackwood sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of the plantation. He knew for sure that his aunt would never let him leave this place alive. He would also be a part of her collection of perfect, quiet things. Thomas Blackwood was stuck in the gold cage of Belle Reve for 2 days. His aunt came to see him 3 times a day and brought him food on a silver tray. Her calm, peaceful mask was back on, but her eyes were clearer than ever, and it was scary. She talked to him like someone would talk to a sick child, saying that he had a fever of the mind and that he would feel better when the doctor got there from New Orleans. Thomas knew that no doctor was coming. He was being held, and his future was being decided. Ara was quietly and carefully planning how to make him shut up for good. He wouldn't eat the food she brought because he was afraid it had the same gentle poison in it that had killed the 7 girls. He spent his time walking around the room, checking the windows and the door for any weak spots. But the house was strong, made of cypress and brick, and would last. It felt like there was no way out. On the 3rd night, he got the hope he needed in the form of a quiet knock on his door long after midnight. It wasn't his aunt. Madame Delphine was the one. She slipped a heavy skeleton key with rust on it under the door. There was a folded piece of paper with it. The note said, "The stables," in shaky, hard-to-read handwriting. "Go now, for their souls, for yours." It took a lot of courage to do that. Delphine knew that by helping him, she was signing her own death warrant. But 17 years of keeping quiet about what she had done had become too much for her soul to bear. Thomas's arrival was a sign from God that it was time to end, no matter how bad it was. Thomas turned the key in the old lock, his hands slick with sweat. The mechanism made a groaning sound, and then it clicked open with a sound like a bone breaking. He quietly left the room and moved through the dark, sleeping house. He could hear the grandfather clock in the hall ticking slowly and steadily. It sounded like it was counting down the last few seconds of Belle Rev's life. He never found out for sure who set the fire. Years later, a traveling minister recorded Delphine's vague confession on her deathbed. She only said that the spirits of the children wanted justice and that the house's evil needed to be burned away. The story that was passed down through the generations of enslaved families was more direct. They said that when Thomas ran toward the stables, a quiet, planned effort began. Someone accidentally knocked over a lantern in the cotton storehouse. Someone carelessly left a candle burning close to the dry linens in the laundry. There wasn't just one fire. There were many small acts of righteous arson that came together to make an unstoppable whole. It was a revolt, a last-ditch effort to clean things up. The first orange flames were already licking at the house's foundations as Thomas rode off into the night. He stopped his horse on a ridge a mile away and looked back. The fire was spreading unnaturally quickly, as if the old dry wood of Belle Rev wanted to burn to show how much pain it had been through over the years. Things got crazy at the house. The fire alarm bell started to ring, a frantic sound that was useless against the roar of the flames. The enslaved people who were part of the play came out of their rooms to watch the show. Their faces were lit up, and they looked both scared and satisfied. And what about Ara? The official report said that her body was burned up in the fire, but we still don't know what happened to her. People who were there that night, on the other hand, tell a different story. They say that when the fire got to the main house, Ara didn't try to get away. Instead, people saw her calmly walk back into the fire, heading for the cellar door as if to join her eternal children in their final fiery apotheosis. But there is another story, a darker whisper that has haunted the bayou for over a century. A Cajun trapper said he saw a woman in a singed, elegant dress walking through the cypress swamp before dawn, her face pale and her eyes empty. People say that Ara wasn't killed by the fire. Instead, it drove her away, destroying her home and breaking her mind. People say she disappeared into the swamp and became a bayou creature, a ghost who will always look for her lost children. People call her the Dame Blanche de Belle Rev, or the White Lady of the Beautiful Dream. This is a scary story that parents tell their kids to keep them away from the water at night. When the volunteer firefighters finally got through the cellar door, they saw what we saw at the start of our story. The fire hadn't gotten to the stone room yet, but the heat from above had made the air shimmer and the plaster on the ceiling crack. The 7 preserved girls sat in their chairs, untouched by the flames. Their calm, painted smiles were a final, horrible insult to the chaos that had been going on above them. The results were quick and clear. The parish leaders were horrified by what they found, and worried that a scandal would hurt the reputations of their most important families. They worked to bury the story completely. The 7 girls' bodies were buried in a single unmarked mass grave in a separate cemetery. Their names were not recorded, and their existence was officially erased. Bulldozers tore down the ruins of Belle Rev, plowed the land, and sold it in pieces. It was as if the plantation had never been there in just 10 years. Thomas Blackwood never went back to the South after what he saw there. He moved to Boston, where he gave up on his writing dreams and became a reclusive academic. He wrote down the whole story in his journal, filling every page with his frantic, spidery writing, as if he were trying to get the poison out of his own head. He put the journal in a chest and locked it up. No one read it until he died in 1899. His estate gave his papers to the Augusta Historical Society. The journal sat in the archives, a ticking time bomb of truth, waiting for someone to find it. The story of Ara Blackwood and her 7 eternal children lived on in only 2 desperate ways: in the sealed academic silence of a hidden archive, and in the lively, whispered oral tradition of the descendants of those who had been enslaved at Belle Reve. For the official written history of America, the story simply stopped existing. It was a secret that was thought to be too dark, strange, and revealing of the terrible things that slavery could let happen in the country's most remote areas. Belle Reve was built on a terrible idea: that one person could own another person so completely that their life, death, and even their body could be turned into a work of art or a collector's item. Ara Blackwood didn't think her act was murder. She thought it was the ultimate act of ownership. She wanted to make a perfect world that would never change, but in doing so, she made a hell. But the people she tried to control and erase from her life were the ones who brought her world crashing down in a baptism of fire. They made sure that even though she might have taken their children's bodies, she could never really end their stories. What do you think really happened to Blackwood? Did she find the peace she was looking for in the flames, dying for her own insanity? Or did she run away to the swamp, where she became another ghost, in a place that was already haunted by its past sins? Please leave a comment below with your theory. The real truth about these dark times isn't always in the official records. It's often in the spaces in between, in the stories that won't go away. If you think these hidden histories should be made public, sign up for the Sealed Room to get more stories from the past's locked archives. And don't forget that every old house and quiet town has its own secrets. You only need to know where to look sometimes.